rise of national populism in the West, where it comes from. This is very much about demographic change. And immigration is important because it is an indicator and a symbol of demographic change, the decline of ethnic majorities, whether that be white Americans in the US, whether that be white British and Brit, ethnic Dutch people in the Netherlands. That's what I'm talking about when I talk about the decline of ethnic majorities in the West, that being the catalyst for the rise of these parties. If we look at US, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, what I've done is I've taken 1965 and 2050 as the bookends for this demographic projection. Demography, by the way, is the most predictable of the social science. If you ask us to predict the composition of the population of a country, we can be a lot more precise because the 50-somethings 50 years from now have already been born, so we already know their ethnic composition, for example, and we just can run that forward in demographic models. Basically, demography is very predictive. So if we run these models, we can see really what's likely to happen in terms of, in ethnocultural terms, in these four countries. So if we take the US case first, about 85% of the United States was what's called non-Hispanic white in 1960. And it goes from 85% to, this was 2017, about 62%. So there's been a significant drop of 20 points between 1965 and 2017. If you just look at the under 5 population of the US, it's already majority minority, or it's about 50-50. So we already can project, okay, if we move ahead to 2050, that under 5 population is going to be the average voter. We're going to be around 50% in the United States, 50% white, from a position of 85% white. That's a major change that we've seen in the largest Western country. The trend by the 2050 is we're going to have a number of countries. Most of these countries are going to be around 50% white, and from a position where they were pretty much 85, 90, 95, 90, even 99% white in 1965. So big, big shift. In Europe, that's going to be a bit more delayed, but not that much more delayed, and it depends on your assumptions around immigration levels. This is just England and Wales, a projection that I did with a demographer. The 50% point is kind of like at the end of the century, but that assumed the birth rates that obtained at the time. We were using the 2011 census numbers, and the birth rate in England and Wales was actually reasonably high. It was like around 1.9 or 1.8. It was relatively high. It's dropped substantially in the last 3-4 years, 5 years. It's now about 1.5. So it's really gone down, and that's just going to bring all of these curves down. And these are just different immigration levels, 350 a year. That's the most we thought was likely. Britain's just had around 700,000 immigrants, net migrants. So these probably will have to be revised. Depending on where the immigration numbers are, that will speed up the flow. But if we're talking about long-term, birth rates are more important in the long run. Birth rate differences between groups are more important in driving this in the long run. Immigration is much more important in the short run. And I think actually this is the picture that underlies the rise of the populist right. In Britain, I've done a study where we said, well, do you want to have more immigration, but it's going to be higher skilled? You're going to get better people in a way. They're going to have higher skilled, or less immigration, but they're going to be lower skilled. That was the choice that we gave people, and people were about 50-50 between those two. But then when you said, okay, well, we're going to have higher immigration with higher skill, but it's going to lead to a bigger change in the ethnic composition of the population. So that with the higher skilled, higher immigration option, Britain is only going to be 58% white British in 2060. Whereas the lower immigration, it'll be 65. All of a sudden, it went from 50-50 to 75-25, just massive change. In addition to that, if we look at the large-scale voting and survey data, one of the things you notice is whether a person is rich or poor, whether they've lost their job or not, it makes hardly any difference to whether they're going to vote for Trump, for Brexit, for a populist right party. It doesn't make much difference. Their socioeconomic status, the economic side doesn't really do much. What really counts is their psychological attitudes. So for example, if you say yes to this question, British culture was better in the past, or I could say, Flemish culture was better in the past. I mean, if you agree with that statement, you are much more likely to be a populist right voter. Whereas whether you're rich or poor makes almost no difference. Even a question like, do you support the death penalty is much more informative than a question about your income. So one of the conclusions really is then that support for populist right parties is driven mainly by cultural and psychological attitudes and not by personal economic circumstances. Another way we can see that is we had an economic crisis in 2007-8. That made no difference to support for the populist right across the West. Zero difference on average. The migrant crisis 2015-16 made a massive difference in almost every country. There were a few exceptions because there's always a certain amount of up and down to do with if there's one coalition in power, another coalition in power, a charismatic leader falls away, there's a no new leader. So there are all these kind of short-term factors that can knock a party's support up and down, but behind it all are these cultural demographic factors. So the AfD in Bavaria, there was a survey done. The question asked was, is Germany losing its culture? 100%. 100% of AfD voters said yes to that question, as opposed to 20%, I think, of Green voters. So that kind of tells you something. Or the Sweden Democrats, do you want immigration reduced in Sweden? 99%. 99% of Sweden Democrat voters. This is the absolute, and this is the consensus, I think, in the academic literature, by the way. People who really look at the numbers, the survey numbers, it's very clear. The people who are voting for these parties are voting for them mainly to do with immigration, and immigration attitudes is tied mainly to psychological and cultural factors and not so much to economic factors. There's two measures. One is, do you want immigration to be reduced a lot, let's say, or increased? That's the attitude to immigration. That's very much tied to your personality, your culture, your ideology. There's a second question, which is, I have a list of 10 issues: healthcare, the pandemic, the economy, unemployment, whatever, and immigration, and we'll have a few other issues, crime, and a few other. How important are these issues? So what happens is when you get an increase in migration, amongst the people who say immigration is fine or we want it increased, there's no change in those people because ideologically they're pro-immigration. But it's the people who say, well, we want immigration restricted. As the numbers go up, immigration goes from their number 5 issue after healthcare and the economy to their number 1 issue or their number 2 issue. And it's that which is what leads to the rise of the populist right. So it's what's called salience, the priority of immigration. It's not the attitude, but the priority rises. There was a study that showed in 9 of 10 West European countries this was the dynamic. And we're seeing this now, I would argue, across many European countries, the increase in the salience. As the salience rises, the populist right rises. And that's what happened in 2014 with the Front National and the Danish People's Party and the UK Independence Party. The UK Independence Party vote was really not about Europe. It was about Europe, but Europe only mattered because of immigration. And actually, non-European immigration was probably the bigger deal than European immigration. It's just that it wasn't acceptable to say that, and so they made it about the European Union. So you had all of these parties get up to close to 30% in 2014. And then in 2015, you had Trump running and eventually winning the Republican primary. And you had Brexit in June of 2016. Brexit, 40% of Brexit voters, immigration is their number 1 issue. This was not about economically left behind people worried about the economics. The economics was a lower priority for them. So that is really what's behind the Brexit vote. And then we have we have Salvini in Italy, and eventually the other pattern we see is that the populist right is no longer just in Italy and maybe Flanders and maybe France and a few other countries where the populist right had already done reasonably well between the late 1980s and the early 2000s. We also see the populist right now in Spain with Vox, and in Portugal with Chega, and in Sweden, and in Germany, and in Britain. All these places that were seen to be impossible. Like people would say, Britain, it has a first-past-the-post system. It has a tradition of fighting fascism. It'll never vote for these parties. Okay, That's Britain. And then, well, Germany, they had the Nazis. They'll never vote for them. And, okay, Germany. And Sweden, no. So all one after the other. And also the share of the vote. When Jean-Marie Le Pen won 18% of the vote, there was 1 million people out demonstrating. When Jörg Haider got 27%, around the same time, the EU went to censure them and exclude them. All of a sudden, we're talking now, instead of 18% and 27%, we're talking about Austria almost, in the runoff, it was almost 50%. It was like 48.6. Le Pen might be the president, maybe, I don't know. So the numbers, her last numbers were, I think, 43% compared to 18%. And there was no people out on the streets, there was no nothing. That tells you how much things have changed. And I think that's very much related to these demographic changes. I should say something about Islam. Islam is a factor. There's no question Islam is a big factor. But it's worth noting that both with the Brexit vote, obviously there is some degree to which the migrant crisis and worries about Islam was playing in the Brexit vote. But also, I would say, if you look at Austria, Haider, they didn't say anything about Islam. Islam wasn't even really an issue. So I actually think it isn't strictly about Islam. It is partly about Islam, but a lot of this is about just declining share of the population. People also not recognizing the society they grew up in.